Okay, now we enter part two of this. If you missed part one, you can go back and catch it in. This is going to be a multi-parter. Each part's going to be in your top left-hand corner. We're going to try to get on through this, but got a few clips of other videos and some other things to talk about that are not in this one. Again, I beseech you to just watch this whole thing yourself instead of the clips that I'm trying to pull out of this if they don't flag it. This is called, Is the New Testament Based on Myths? Pagan Christ by Timeline. And they give you just one set of views and how Horus might be attached to this. They even used an ordained priest who's ended up finding out this information along with other people that have written books and so on. So let's continue with the idea of whenever there was a battle between Gnostics and spirituality concept and the ones that wanted to make it reality and say that gods were attached to people in a different way, and who actually won out of that.
All through history, it has been the winners in any battle or any struggle that get to write the story and get to write how it happened.
Joshua, as it would have been, Jesus is just the Greek name. The Joshua cult probably goes back 200 years at least before the time that we think of as Jesus being born. And
again, as I said before in the last one, Joshua's in the Old Testament. A lot of people are familiar with the idea of Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho. Well, if you look at the timeline when the Jericho wall fell down, it doesn't fit the biblical timeline at all. There have been people that have actually gone through all these Middle Eastern sites trying to prove the Bible, and in doing so, they proved that what I'm telling you is true, that it spans different ages of time, that they can't take Joshua and have him run through and do all of these things that he did at one time or during one lifetime's epoch. It doesn't work out. Some of the sites that are claimed to have been destroyed really were just left and not even destroyed. But Joshua, Jesus, as he said, is just the Greek name. So then we have that Greek form going on and that taken in, and everything changed too. So it's already gone through 3 or 4 changes, and as I've shown before in a few separate videos, the Greeks took a lot from the Sumerians in their knowledge. They knew it at the time, and apparently they could read cuneiform and had a lot of talks with them, just like they had talks with the priests of Sais and so on, that we get the Atlantis stories and everything from, but it's not spoken of as much because Babylon is tried to look at as being bad, even though that's the point. It even says so in your Bible, that we actually had creation at where the gods were whenever that happened and so on. It was after that the flood happens in Samaria, and then a few generations later, not really long after Noah passes away, Abraham, who used to live in Ur, moves. And then it also says conspicuously that they started to worship other gods, when the next god they run into is with Melchizedek and so on too. And if we look at that, they're trying to say that's the same god, that's the same god, that's the same god. Well, that's Saturn. That's why we have Saturday. Same aspect, same kind of thing, different name, just like the storm gods we mentioned before. Just like Jupiter, who takes over, and the storm gods and all these other religions at a certain point take over. But in reality, that really isn't a time of war and a time of Aries and Mars. And the people realize that we gotta quit doing this, or we just keep decimating ourselves over and over again no matter what, and eventually the snake turns around and bites its own tail. And we have to quit that. And you'd think that it happened then, but that quitting is just now starting to cease in a lot of these countries, in fact the ones that are involved there. But the demographic is not the same in those countries anymore as it was in the time that we're talking about either, as I've shown. Let's continue.
And so to really understand the nature of Gnostic mythology, you have to completely get away from the idea there's just the story we have in the New Testament. The Gnostic Gospels, of which we now have a large number, said you had to write your own Gospel to show you were initiated. So you can imagine how many there must have been. And so there's the whole cycle of myths. We have Christian commentators saying, yeah, all those stories of the pagan god, and they're admitting, you know, you have stories of the God-man riding a donkey. You have stories of the God-man dying and resurrecting. But yours are just stories. As really happened.
There's where the card flips over all of a sudden. Well, to everybody that ever heard these stories too, they looked at it as being something that really happened in the Wayback Machine before too, didn't they? Because it's all ancestor veneration and worship, and as I've shown before in other videos that make attachments into all of this, it was ancestor veneration, going way back from skull cults and so on, like in Jericho that we just mentioned, another place where they put these masks on people and so on, and then there they put people on daises and so on. That goes back to 8,000 or 9,000 BC though, but it's amazing what we're finding was going on 8,000 or 9,000 BC in Göbekli Tepe and all the sites that have to do with that, and the Natufian culture that actually ended up heralding a lot of this. For they grew huge, didn't they? They have a different name too, but we're no longer able to say that concept. Let's continue.
Where and how the whole thing actually crystallized and took shape into what we now know as Christianity is still veiled in a mist. It's becoming clearer, and I think ordinary people suspect that there's a lot more there to be told that they haven't been told. And the truth is that that's right, that there was cover-up, there was persecution of those who disagreed.
So, whenever this first kicked off, it didn't even kick off right after Jesus happened. One of the strangest things about it all, of course, is it tells you in the Gospels that whenever Jesus rose again, that all these graves broke in and people and saints that were undead walked the earth around and did all these other things. And yet, those people that used to like to write a lot of stuff and witness this and would have been really around the situation and been able to talk to a lot of people enough to verify it, just like if something really happened today. There's nothing. Even Greek historians of the time that were right there in the thick of it, no mention. During the exact time, no. Right after even, no. But Eusebius and a few people who were catering to this new idea they had going on were able to set things up like it's ready to go. He even says it in his Gospels. I believe they mention it in this or the other one. It's this one, I think. Here you can see this Christian persecution that's going on here. If you look close, there's a whole lot of people being killed by those people that took over, and there on your right hand side is Titus riding in on a white horse. This is one of the representations you can find in art of the idea of revelations, because they did have 4-horse chariots coming in, and that's the 4 horsemen and so on too. And just out of screen on your left hand side is the menorah and things that they're taking as they raise that temple to the ground. Again, I beseech you to look up Flavian signature and see a different presentation that's done real professionally that actually shows you that Josephus Flavius, who had a connection to him, which they call a Jewish historian, because he's writing the history of it, isn't he? And how it's been conflagrated, and 24 lines is all that we have that has anything to connect to this at all. And most scholars that have looked into it have realized long ago, and repeatedly over and over again, that that's not even the right vernacular and stuff, and this has been inserted in here. In fact, that had happened into the Bible quite a few places too, but let's continue. Christian persecution, by the way, that goes real flip-flop. I mean, it didn't happen as bad as you think it was. And a lot of people tried to give themselves up as martyrs. It even tells you in the Bible how they do that. And how they did that. And how they wanted to be like Christ and wanted to do these things. And hung upside down and rest. Let's continue.
According to Tom Harper, the church would preside over the largest and bloodiest cover-up in history.
So how did that work? How does this cover-up kind of work? Well, like I said before, you just kill everybody.
This is the Roman, the Via Sacra, the Holy Road.
This is the Via Sacra in Rome, one of the old streets. All roads lead to Rome?
Via Sacra,
well, they did it one
the
time.
Sacred Road, is the main street of ancient Rome and leads through some of its most important pagan holy sites. And at the beginning of the 4th century, under the newly crowned Emperor Constantine, it was a place of great chaos. The entire Western Roman Empire was in a state of collapse.
Constantine had to battle 5 other emperors from the various parts of the empire who were all trying to make a play for the throne. So the idea of, you know, let's all sing from the same hymn sheet became a really important and urgent matter for people. The Roman Empire was disintegrating. The barbarians were on the borders.
Yeah, the Celtic people, if you look, ended up destroying the Roman Empire, but it didn't actually go away because all roads led to Rome, like I was talking about before, as they say, but that means that also all the way from Britain and other places were leading through there because they heralded out of the Etruscans, who predate them, and the people of Italy. It was all taken together, but a lot of those roads were made well before what you would think of actually being there in Rome in the first place. Strangely, the Vatican is named after Vatica, and Vatica is a Etruscan goddess of death. And if you look at her, she has like goat horns and so on going on, and you've got to go, oh my God, that's pagan, that's devil worship, everything. Yeah, that's what you've been led to believe, that anything happens. But back then, people were embracing the idea of the zodiac and what age they were in. So there was Taurus the bull and people that had bull horns going on. It's shown in the Sumerians and so on. And after that, there were goats in the time of Aries. And you can see that, and rams in the Egyptians showing up over and over again. And the idea of, at Mount Sinai, changing from the idea of sacrificing a calf to sacrificing rams from there on. People don't seem to catch that. But just like Moses said, people have a sniffed neck and they won't look up because a lot of this is astrotheological and zodiacal. But you also look up depictions of Moses, and a lot of them, just look up Moses with horns on Google Image or something, DuckDuckGo, you'll actually find that there are a lot of depictions back in the day of Moses with horns, because it says it right there in the Bible, and they try to say, oh, that was light coming out, and people were scared he had to wear a veil over his head. Yeah, he turned into something that looked like that. Well, if you had him go up and meet a god and he came down and he looked like that, then you'd say he turned into the devil, wouldn't you? Isn't that strange? Look up the depictions of El sitting on his throne and you go, well, okay, so that's supposed to be some kind of Satan thing, isn't it? Well, yeah, it's been turned into that. The idea of a pitchfork of Poseidon, where Sidon is actually still a city that's right there above Baalbek and so on. What about the city of Joppa? Oh, well, that comes later, but they're all right there in that same area. But we're not led to think things along that line and timelines and when things actually happen. You've got this story in you and Christmas and everything, and oh boy. It's a little different than that, though, in reality.
In trying to unify his empire, Constantine was plagued by the fact that there were virtually dozens of religious cults to choose from. Christianity was against the law, and anyone practicing it was persecuted and killed. The most celebrated reminder of this persecution is the Roman Colosseum.
There's the Colosseum, and you can see this under area that they have there where they had all the things and creatures, and they would take and run lions down runs and up into a pit, and then they would take and lift them up in that cage and up into the stadium there where everybody could see it. And also there were times whenever they flooded this whole thing out and they had ship battles that are between there and so on. You can imagine how long it took to fill them up, but hey, they had aqueducts and stuff going on there too. It's amazing we still have stadiums today. Stadia is a sacred geometry lineage measurement, though. It's all based on that, just like the inch and the foot and the mile and so on. It's 1,000 paces. But when we see this, a lot of people that are deep into Christianity think about the idea of persecution that goes on there. But then shortly after, and the reason this is pretty much half torn down and so on is by those same people. And the fact that we ended up accepting it and it took over from the whole world should be looked at as a place where they go, wow, this is where a lot of it really happened at, as opposed to, oh man, they're bad, we want to smash it up, smash the noses off the Egyptian statues and everything. Christian zealots caused a whole lot of that. In fact, there's a lot that Christianity that you're not led to know anything about, that all of a sudden after this Jesus point, everybody was walking around like hippies handing flowers out. It's what you're led to believe, kind of, isn't it?
But Tom Harper began to see a different side to this persecution.
The Christians were persecuted somewhat at first, not as much as they have claimed, by the way, but they were persecuted, and some of them actually begged to be persecuted, much as suicide bombers will give their lives today.
Just like some of the apostles and the way they were killed or whatever, that's just some way of ditching them out and saying that that happened to them and stuff off of it. But then again, there are 12 apostles, and the reason for the 12 is for the zodiac. For it's the zodiac that goes around the sun and so on. It's the same thing. It's the same thing in everybody, but you're led to believe that it's something different. Yet, oh, they're Jesus. Well, they turned him into a sun god. He really wasn't a sun god. You know what? Yeah, he was. In fact, Yahshua was a sun god. Yeah, just like Israel was the ancient Phoenician or Canaanite name for the planet that we know of as Saturn. Oh, check it out.
But after the persecuting phase was over, they became the persecutors. And they became very vicious in their persecution of roasting out anything that smacked of other than Christian.
So, what's odd about that moment there that we're thinking of is something clicked very different, didn't it? For first of all, we can tell that there was a lot of religions going on, and all of the gods and these major pantheons all over the place, and people still had all this going, but it was getting old. Just like this one is kind of getting old to some people. And the ideas, especially what we've tried to train into it. But it was getting old, if you say, and they started looking other places for some wisdom to help show you another story of the same situation and going on. And the story of the idea of Mythras and Saul Invictus and so on really got entrenched in these people. And then that was the mock, or was it the blueprint, for turning around and having a Christ again. And the timing was supposed to signify the end of Julius Caesar and the start of the Flavians, and deify the Flavians, just like there were deified people, of course, in Sumeria, and then demigod situations that we know about, but the same situation going on in Egypt and all over the Middle East. Nothing's any different. Why should this be considered to be so different? Well, we were told that it was, that, like the man said, yours are all just stories. Ours finally did that story that you had before us, and it really happened now. You can see why they had to wipe all that out, and to the point that you don't really hear or know about it in a modern day unless you study deep. And just a few hundred years ago, you were a witch if you knew any of these things during the Dark Ages and everything. But let's not go that deep into that. Let's go on with this and the persecution and the way that it flipped.
The shift in attitude towards Christianity was a direct response to Constantine's need to assert order in his empire. Following his victory at the Milvian Bridge, he had a vision of the sign of the cross and converted from paganism to Christianity to become the first Christian emperor and supreme pontiff.
That would be looked at as a modern day as a pope, that type of concept. So he wanted to put himself in that situation. And it said that he's supposed to be the conduit of God. But that was supposed to have been Jesus. But then Jesus is in all of us, and this is the man that's representing that situation, and he's called our Pope. That's not the way we look at it. That's the way they did. See, that's even been twisted and changed a little bit, isn't it? You can see the people involved here.
What he wanted was one God, one emperor. Let's just have one Jesus, please, and let's stick to the story.
In 325 AD, Constantine called together his bishops of the Roman Empire to form the Council of Nicaea. Their goal was to reach consensus.
And if you'll look into this, there's a whole lot of apologetics that go to this point. And the reason the apologetics go to this point is because if this gets ruined, it all falls apart like the house of cards or Jenga if you yank the wrong brick out. But at the Council of Nicaea, they decided that Jesus was a God and that he was the Son of God, S-O-N. Yes, he was S-U-N too. But in doing so, they were one and the same, and all of that conflagrated. It's all put together, and we're all going to agree on it. If you'll look into it, there were a lot of people that totally disagree with this situation, and mainly it was because it wasn't true. And that they said, well, look, we've done this before. You know all the stories. Yeah, but why are you screwing this up with something that everybody knows is a lie? Well, hell, we're at 325 now. How many people are sure that this didn't happen and it wasn't real? If we start saying it's real, it won't take but a couple of generations and killing a few million people and so on, and then a few more generations, and eventually a couple of more 100 years and dark ages, and oh my gosh, what people had to go through. Again, I tell you, I don't like to go to the dark ages because it starts to get real personal. Before, it seems like you can step out of yourself and be in that moment and not care as much as whenever it really starts affecting what you know of as your history and where it comes from.
And they voted in that Jesus was equal to God, and that's where you got the beginning of what we call today the Nicene Creed.
We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord, Jesus Christ.
What he wanted was unity, and they got unity when the majority agreed that the Father and the Son were co-equal. Once that happened, then they said anything else is heretical.
Salvation came down from heaven.
I could show you a few pictures right now of Jesus showing a sacred symbol and having a swastika on his lapel places, but we don't need to go there. And that what you really think is definitely not any part of the founding of this religion actually was one of the symbols of the major people that did found this and that had the stories from before. And again, the 10, 12 tribes that you think about and are talked about and alluded to actually go much bigger. They are trying to encompass it all in one story, and that it happened, and at this one moment in time, we based our calendars on it and so on. Well, we were able to give a definitive date and start working from there with it. That's one good thing about it. Bad thing is that we've actually turned a myth into a lie that says it's true. And whether you believe Jesus showed up and did a few things and they elaborated on it, or whatever you believe might have happened out of it, whenever you look into it, someone elaborated on the situation a whole lot to end up where we are now. That's about the best apologetic you can get out of somebody who really studies theology. On a worse spectrum of it, you can see that it's all conflagrated and made up, and it was trying to mush everything together as one.
Was incarnate by the Holy Spirit of the Virgin Mary, and was made man.
You don't agree with it, you'll be banished. And in the Roman world, that meant death. You were exiled beyond the borders of the empire, and that was it. So, you know, the trail of deceit, deception, destruction of the evidence was actually quite a pious thing that they were trying to do. They were trying to hold the whole thing together around one particular story.
And we all know that story now, but at this point that we're talking about in time, it hadn't even been totally agreed upon. But that's what they were trying to agree upon, and throw out anything that if they got the kernel of the story right, then either it fit or it didn't. And there was a lot of people that didn't want certain books in the Bible in there, and there's a lot of things that we don't even know were books that were in the Bible at this point, like Enoch and so on like that have been taken out of it. On the other series I'm going into right after this, I'm going to show you a couple of those too. It'll just be a continuation because we've already talked about this.
And we believe one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. We acknowledge one baptism for the remission of sins, and we look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. Amen.
To maintain absolute order, any traces of pagan ties to Christianity were destroyed.
But you see that little symbol there, and you think of it maybe a cross, or people used to have a staff, and on the top of it they had a circle with a little cross that goes onto it. And that's somebody going around teaching astrotheology, and somebody using these myths and so on to relay stories to people. And we have an understanding now that they kind of knew that it was a story that was supposed to teach you something, as opposed to the way that we look at it in a modern day. Now we see a Christmas wreath around it also, don't we? That's a symbol before time, though. That symbol goes way back. You can find it in the ancient Sumerians and so on too, way before anything that we think about. But then again, they have a guy that's reborn every December 25th or at winter solstice out of a sacred pine tree, and to worship them. They even talk about it in the Bible. They would chop down a tree and take it in your house and decorate it up and try to put stars all over it and pick a sacred one out in a grove and leave gifts to it. And that's a great founding part of what we have as Christmas today, and it predates a lot of that. Also, again, Saturnalia, based on Saturn, again, our reason for Saturday, which is still kept in every week. Everybody knows that. Imagine how many times you keep saying that and invoking it and going through Saturday. But then, of course, the Sunday, the church day, is all about the sun. See, and then the moon for the women. And then Tuesday was an ancient Celtic goddess. Woden's day is Odin. Thursday is Thor's day. But isn't that also Jupiter? Isn't that also Zeus? Isn't that also the storm god concept, like Enlil? Isn't it all just so much bigger if you'll just open up the veil?
The pagan world was regarded as such a threat because everybody knew that this was the same. We have pagan commentators saying, hang on, this story that you're peddling as your Jesus Christ, Son of God, these are our Dionysus mysteries. All of those people were put to death, they were exiled, books were burned, temples were torn down, crosses over everything. They tore down the ancient world.
They literally defaced the ancient world from what it used to be. It's a humbling moment to actually figure out, to try to make this what we believe in today, how they took things that were all, of course, pagan, and just defaced all these statues and tried to destroy it. And people have tried to make up stupid statements of why they would deface them, but they were doing them in the idea of defacing that religion and taking it away. And due to their anger and angst, the Crusades and on, part of those Crusaders, though, the Templars, ended up figuring out that it was much bigger and brought an idea back of a conceptive conflagration known as Baphomet. And lo and behold, while we have Valentine's Day, and so a lot of the great temples were all torn down or they were repurposed, just like the ancient temples of the Canaanites were knocked down but then rebuilt again, like Baalbek and so on, to worship basically the same god again, but their guise of it, their version of a very similar situation. But then when you see all those temples around ancient Greece, Rome itself, what would make these people change so radically to just drop everything that they have of their heritage for something like that? And people try to use that and say, well, that's the power of Christ. No, that's the power of killing and ruining everything that has to do with not Christ. See, the anointed thing is Horus. We talked about that before. He's Christus and Eusus. And we know that is Eusus, that's Jesus. Yeah. It's an idea that they all had, something that had been going on for a long, long time. Again, much bigger than we ever thought. But you have to pick through rubble now to figure it out, instead of finding things which are kind of rare in their pristine state. And of course, a lot of the known knowledge of all this was burned in the Library of Alexandria. It's one of the main reasons it went on up. Of course, I've done a couple of videos about showing the reality of that. It wasn't a one-time event and so on, but they'll tell you here that a lot of those that were about the religion were taken from those and hidden in Coptic places and so on, but then they got persecuted, and that's how we ended up getting eventually the Nag Hammadi text and so on.
There's one letter written by a Roman to the emperor just saying, no, look, there's black-clad monks tearing down the wonders of the ancient world. I mean, what happened in that period, if you look back? We went from the most advanced civilization which had been on the planet to the Dark Ages. They're called the Dark Ages for a reason.
As I've tried to explain, that's, again, one of the reasons I hate the Dark Ages or getting anywhere close to it, or being able to take from not too many hundred years past the point of Christ, like the time we were trying to refer of whenever they're trying to lock this down, which was hundreds of years later, and bring it into what we know today. And these people had to do it in secret. All of a sudden, their religion, which was wide out and open, and what everything was about, was all hidden.
In this ancient pagan temple, the Serapeum, in Alexandria, Egypt, members of the Serapis cult were forced to secretly worship statues of their gods and goddesses in dark tunnels deep beneath the earth.
Or the people of Mythras, where they had to have a little fake cave kind of thing made with an arch over dome into it, and they had the Mythras symbol inside there. And a lot of people said, oh, that's because they would go in there and they would smoke out and do all these other things too, and drink and so on, and then have communal, where they would break bread and do all those things too. And yeah, that's the story. And water and the wine and that, and water goes bad. Water has parasites and stuff in it. You put enough alcohol into it, it clears everything out, and then you water it down, and that purifies the extra water that you're putting in there along with that. So everybody used to drink wine, but it was way thinned down. Take a bottle of wine that you have now and thin it down by 3 or 4, and you end up getting the idea of what they had going on back then. And beer and so on. I've talked about the history of beers and so on. Did a video on Serapis, which this is looking at one of the temples that was made to hide it whenever it used to be wide out in the open. And I refer to that also in the video there if you go back and watch it or you remember watching it. And this might make a couple connections on the idea of how that happens at the end. For that's the Apis bull, the scapegoat to put everything on at the end of the year. Just like we have a New Year's resolution to this day, and you would kill the animal and take all your sins away and do so on. You don't think that's in the Bible, it's in the Old Testament like crazy. Definitely refers to this exact situation. In fact, when they did so, they would give one to Azazel off in the wilderness. And when you look at that, like, who's that? That's just the bad of everything. Oh, you're actually sacrificing to a satanic type god. The opposite. Yin and yang is what you're doing. Oh, but that's got to be the devil. No. Yin and yang is what you're doing. You're covering both bases. But neither one of these are the devil. All the gods that were of the underworld were all in lieu with everything that goes on. And hey, you live for a short amount of time, and the rest of eternity, if you believe in such, you'll be living in this other place. So hell and that God that's there has a lot more sway over the length of time of your existence than the one that we're talking about now, unless we start looking at resurrection and all kinds of other concepts that are bleeded out of the Bible and its concept too. For again, like the guy said, the concept of resurrecting is resurrecting oneself. It's inside yourself. You symbolically die and then come back. Some of these mystery schools, they would give you a potion to drink, and after you drank it, they would tell you you drank poison and you're going to go through death and do all this stuff, and you would freak out, and it's really enough opium to just totally wipe you and do, and then they would bring you back out of it, you'd knock out and so on and come back from it and everything, and they'd tell you that you resurrected, you came back from it and everything, and it was symbolic. They have this in Masonic rites and everything too, if you ever looked into it.
On the shelves of these caves laid religious texts, scrolls, and papyri of their cult, hidden away for safekeeping. One of those whose job it was to teach the ancient wisdom of these pagan stories was Hypatia, a Greco-Roman philosopher who lectured at the Serapeum.
In about 401, a Christian mob, with the knowledge of the Archbishop, his name was Cyril, hounded Hypatia and killed her in a very cruel manner.
They basically like stoned her to death, and then they burnt her alive or dead, and then cremated her actually, and burned her bones and everything onto it. And if you listen, this is 401. So people are still doing this Gnostic thing all through this. This is where we get the Nag Hammadi text for, because when this started to happening, some of the priests took some of the sacred knowledge that was there and shoved it into urns and took it out in the desert, and it's the reason we have it now. For all the rest of it was burned, as he's fixing to tell you.
And then burned her bones to ashes. So she would have been very much in sympathy with Gnostic form because she was a philosopher. She just was a brilliant exponent of a way of life that they were no longer going, a way of thinking, they were no longer going to tolerate, and they didn't.
And that's just one of many. It's kind of the reason I hate to go there. Because Hypatia, have you ever heard of her? I've heard of people with that name, but that's where that comes from. And she was persecuted. And then they turned around and tried to say things about her. Just like they turned around and tried to make the Whore of Babylon and all those type of ideas out of somebody who was very sacred to the other religion.
The Christians allegedly burned the books which had been moved out of the library into the Serapeum, the sanctuary. They burned all the books there.
You know, that was the greatest collection of human wisdom on the planet at the time. And the entire thing was put to the torch.
Because it was basically pagan by Christian zealots and people who wanted to force everybody into this belief. And if they had all this paganism going on and all of these different gods and goddesses that did things, and there was a god of the river and a god of this, that, and the other, can't be having that. None of those exist, even though in the Bible it actually clearly describes there being 72 different gods, and that Yahweh was only the one that was the major one over these people, and that everybody else had their own, and apparently they were gods. They use the same name, and it's Elohim, which is plural, which when it shows in the Bible shows you that they had a pantheon too. As shown before, Asherah was God's wife. Their son was named Baal. It was El, Asherah, and Baal, but now then it was Yahweh, Asherah, and Baal was Yahweh, are the antithesis. And then wait, isn't that Jesus again? Got another video showing you that Jesus, Gnostics' belief and stuff, that Jesus wasn't even the one that was on the cross. I'll get to that probably in the next one that we have here, but let's continue here, see if I can get through this.
Because it was considered heresy. We have Saint Augustine saying, you know, now we have the scriptures, we don't need any other texts. An encyclical went out from Rome saying that all of these texts must be destroyed, the Gnostic Gospels. We're only going to have these four, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All the rest are heretical. So at that point, somebody went out into the Egyptian desert with a vase containing what their most sacred texts, and they hid them, and they didn't come back for them. And you have to wonder what happened to them, that they didn't come back.
Well, they all left Egypt, and there was another exodus of people, the Caucasians that used to rule Egypt, leaving again, a conflagration of people that were there after the Greeks and so on, and they ended up leaving in droves too, because they didn't want to be persecuted. In fact, that's really the reason of the founding of America, was the idea that, well, people shoving stuff up your ass anymore and trying to kill you if you don't believe certain things. You can do whatever the hell you want to. Well, we are a Christian nation, and it's clearly stated that that's the people that are supposed to inhabit America. It doesn't talk about other people, and in doing so shows you that also things have been changed about that idea. For whenever I grew up, they all talked about how we were a melting pot. Well, the original melting pot was all the different types of Caucasians, from Germans, Spaniards, Italian, French, UK, Britain, people, Scots, Irish, all over the place, man. A melting pot, make things great. They've definitely been able to, even though they've been hampered by a lot of other people. And of course, in our modern day, everything's supposed to be white man bad, recent primitive, fantastic, I guess, but let's not go there.
Next to the Church of the Nativity, in a long and winding cave, the first common translation of the Latin New Testament Bible was commissioned by Rome. With the help of two nuns, it was written by church father and Bible scholar Saint Jerome. The doctrines of the new faith were then set in stone.
Once you've got something written down, thou shalt always repeat this story like this. And that's what happened at that time.
And then the Gnosticism thing went away, and it was looked at as being a literal story, as opposed to what it had been all the way through, and even into hundreds of years of its inception. People don't want to hear this. They hear all kinds of apologetics. This is reality. Well after 400 years AD was this coming into fruition, and literally through the Dark Ages it was still being shoved and pushed onto people. Persecution back against the Jews, the Spanish Inquisition, all the things that I don't want to go into. We're going to go on to part 3 now. It's in your top left-hand corner. Hit like before you go. Say something if you will. Pause it, and then I'll see you there. Peace.